Welcome to the Middleware Tech YouTube channel. Today, we're starting a complete course on Spring Boot. In this series, you'll learn Spring Framework and Spring Boot comparison. Let's get started.
I can create my web application using a Spring Framework. Yes. Today I'm talking about no, I should not go for a Spring Framework. I should go for a Spring Boot. So is it different than a Spring Framework? A Spring Boot is implementing a Spring Framework only. Spring Framework. The thing here. Spring Framework we are talking about. So if I'm going to work on a Spring, you'll find a Spring Framework. A Spring has two different versions. One is, if you want to just segregate two different versions. Another is one is Spring 4.x. Generally, it is used. Another is Spring 5.x. These are the two Spring versions, right? And if you worked on a Spring Framework, what you find is that what you find general traditional MV application, if you have worked on a Spring Framework, you find like the view layer, the request will come from view layer, whatever assume registration view, assume. It will first, the request will come to whom? When a request will come to the view layer, assume that the post warning view is a registration view .jsp. So when you send a request, where it will go? First it will go, if you remember how it work in a Spring Framework, it will go to web.xml file. Web.xml file contain the inbuilt servlet. Its name is dispatcher servlet. So first the request will come to dispatcher servlet. In case of Spring MVC, correct? So first the request will come to whom? Dispatcher servlet. Okay, where is the dispatcher servlet path is defined inside the web.xml file. After that, when you are going request will go to the dispatcher servlet, there is one parameter called init param. It will load one configuration file that is called dispatcher supporting controller. One configuration file it will load that have all the details about. So sometimes we use the name of the file as dispatcher servlet.xml, right? Dispatcher servlet.xml. Like this way, different application they'll find different name. Or this is the corresponding configuration file where it will request will be forwarded, and from there the request, if you see how I'm talking about how it work in our Spring Web MVC, the request will be forwarded to your yes, it is here. Front control request will come to front controller. It will forward it to a handler servlet. Where this one? This is Spring Dispatcher servlet.xml. We use the term Spring Dispatchers. It's okay. You can use Spring Dispatcher servlet.xml. Fine. Then the request will be forwarded to a registration controller .java. From there it will go to the service layer. From there it will go to the DAO layer. It's the flow, right? It will go to controller, right? And from there it will go to reg service.java, and from there it will go to reg DAO.java. Fine, it's like this. That is in the Spring Framework, Spring MVC. If you have worked on, you'll find this is the basic flow. I'm just saying the basic flow is request will go, response will come. Right, fine. But what happened in case of this for Spring 4? This is what is Spring 4. If you worked on a Spring 4, you find this is like this. Spring 4, okay, 4.x. We generally follow this approach. When you come to Spring 5, okay, when you come to Spring 5, if you worked on a Spring 5, the Spring 5.x, what they do is that they are same Control C, same flow. You'll find in Spring 5, these two steps they have replaced with some app app configuration. Just give me 1 minute. Now, when you go to Spring 5, you can see the .xml will follow. So this web.xml and Spring Dispatcher both the file get replaced with a single file. You can find some different name can also be used. It should be like this. So ultimately, this is the basic flow that happened in Spring 4.x version, Spring 5.x version, as you find here. So in basic Spring framework, already we know that it supports the concept of dependency injection. So using dependency injection in Spring framework, if you're not going to use a Spring framework, you have to write all the JDBC code, you have to load the driver, get the connection, close the connection, right? So in Spring framework, if you see, they have implemented the concept of dependency injection in database interaction. Okay, so what is the advantage when you go to Spring framework? You'll find one of the major advantage of a Spring framework is that it will reduce plumbing of code of JDBC. It will reduce plumbing of code of JDBC because it is using the concept of plumbing of code of JDBC because it is using the concept dependency injection. Since you are using the concept dependency injection, if you have worked on Spring with Spring JDBC or template or Spring Hibernate template using a Spring framework, if you have interacted with the database, you'll find that lots of JDBC related code we have optimized, right? We have reduced a number of codes. And it will reduce plumbing of JDBC because since we can implement dependency injection using a Spring framework with the database. And using a Spring framework, as you know that Spring framework is one of the popular open source framework today. And you can implement a very good integration with other popular framework also. Okay. So you can just write here one point, since DI, right? Dependency injection we're using, right? That's why. Okay, so what we're talking about is that since the Spring framework is one of the popular framework in the market, the popular open source framework in the market. Okay, and so that you'll find very good integration with some of the popular framework. Especially in Spring, there is one module called Spring integration. I think this module a few weeks back, Spring integration. So using Spring integration with the help of a Spring framework, you can connect with some other external applications also. So good integration with other popular framework, you can say. Good integration with other popular framework, you can say. using a Spring Framework that you get. Right now, if you have worked on a Spring Framework or Spring MVC, this type of application, right, you can see here lots of files and their integration you have to maintain, especially web.xml file, Spring Dispatcher server.xml file. Lots of configuration is there. Configuration, right, and this configuration it will increase as the number of use cases will increase. For 4 to 5 use case, okay, fine, you can implement a very good Spring MVC application. But if the number of use case, it is increasing 30 use case, 40 use case, even 200 use case, you'll find the complete application will be, lots of configurations and difficult to maintain. That is one of the major limitation with Spring Framework implementation without going to Spring Boot. Okay, so what I'm saying is that another one point about Spring Framework. Yes, it's a very popular Spring Framework today, but if number of use case for enterprise level application, if number of use case increases, okay, all right, that time the problems will come because lots of configuration with the time it is difficult to maintain. So you can write, lots of configuration, lots of configuration you'll find, and with the time difficult to maintain. Okay, that is one of the major things you'll find. Right, okay. Another one point you'll find, I'm just saying some of the very common issues. If you're working a particular application, the Spring MVC, and that is returning some JSON object, or it is returning some XML, or you are going to connect with some external database called JDBC, or Oracle database, or MySQL database, or some file, or some SOAP web service or REST web service you want to implement using a Spring. Everything you can do using a Spring Framework. Now, what you have to do when you're going to do this type of implementation, you have to add all the dependency in the mapping. And based on the dependency, Maven will add all the jars. Correct? So what you have to do here is that in Spring Framework, if you worked on you have implemented any Spring MVC web application using a Spring MVC, you will find that we have to add lots of dependency, in the mapping, and based on the dependency, Maven will add all the jar files, right? We have to add. We have to add lots of dependency and based on the dependency, Maven will add all the jars, that we generally do in Spring Framework. Now the question is that what is the advantage then I'm going to do the same in Spring Framework only, using a Spring Boot. Same Spring Framework only you're going to do using a Spring Boot. Then what is the advantage we'll get using a Spring Boot? Now, if you remember a particular, if you are going to create a Spring Framework, a particular, a Spring Web application, a Spring MVC application, if you want to implement first time and a Spring MVC application, any use case, assume login use case you're implementing. you will find if you're doing first time, it may take up to 1 hour. If you're doing it first time, it will take for first time, it will take to implement the configurations 1.5 hours it may take sometimes. Okay, right. But that is not the scenario in case of a Spring Boot. In case of a Spring Boot, it make if I need a ready-made application with a fraction of second, okay, I need a production grade Spring-based application within a 1 or 2 minutes. I want a production grade Spring-based application. Then Spring Boot is the best choice. Again, I'm saying, in the Spring framework, you do all the things. It is not that you cannot do anything else. You can do everything, whatever you want, all type of implementation you can do using a Spring framework. REST web service, database interaction, any type of database interaction, AOP implementation, UI Spring Web, right? Everything you can do using a Spring framework. Then why I'll go for a Spring Boot? The thing is that same Spring MVC application, if you are doing first time, it may take half an hour to 1 hour. But using a Spring Boot, if I'm doing first time itself and a Spring Boot application, it make I'll get a production grade Spring Boot application within a fraction of second. It is easy to create production grade Spring based application within a fraction of second. Within just the fact I can get the production ready Spring based application in case of a Spring Boot, right? So first point, what we find in the Spring Boot, or what is the advantage of using a Spring Boot above a Spring framework, is that it makes using a Spring Boot, we can make or it is easy to create production grade Spring based application. It is easy to create production based or production grade, you can say production grade Spring based application. One of the advantage of above Spring framework. I want to get ready-made application. Yes, it's ready within a fraction of a second. You can get it. How I can get it? How I can get it? How I can get it? With the help of Spring Initializer. You have to just go to Spring Initializer. Using a Spring Initializer, you can get a production ready Spring application within a fraction of a second. Right? This is one of the advantage. One of the advantage of using a Spring Boot. Right? So where I have to go? Just you have to go to start.spring.io. Just see here, start.spring.io. You have to use this to create an immediate production-based application. How? Just see here. Just see. Control C. I have to go to URL. Control V. Enter. It's called Spring Initializer. So just you have to come to this in the URL. You can see here Spring Initializer, and you have to provide the corresponding parameter for your Spring production-based application, what you want, and based on that you can create the application immediately. Just see here how I can create it. I want to create a project using Maven. Java I want to use. Spring Boot version I want to use 2.3. And all the default settings, group name, artifact name are this. I want to use Java 8 version. packaging is jar, and I want to create an web MVC application. So I want to need a particular dependency called Spring Web dependency I have added because I want to create a web application, Spring MVC application. That's it, and generate. Just see here, our production ready application is done. Demo.zip. So how long time it to take to create an application? This, right? Within a fraction of a second, our application is ready. Right? I'll talk about it later. That is the first point. Second point about Spring Boot. Second point, if I want to say, Spring Boot, it will do lots of auto configuration. Okay. If you have worked on a Spring Framework, you may find that you have to use multiple dependencies you have to add separately inside. But in case of Spring Boot, it will do lots of auto configuration for the project. Okay, it will do lots of auto configuration. Lots of auto configuration you'll find. Now, when I worked on Spring Boot, one of the thing, see, let me do one by one. Now, when you're working with a simple Spring Framework, what have you used? If you remember, you have to use one Tomcat server. Whatever version you are going to use, you have to use one Tomcat server. Tomcat server you have to use, right? And this Tomcat server, you have to do the setup, local setup. You have to get a local setup of Tomcat server in your system for your Spring Framework. If I'm going to do an Spring MVC application. So you need a local setup of the Tomcat server, right? But in case of a Spring Boot, just now I've created one project. Just see here, Spring Boot. I just have created one project, right? A ready-made project, production ready project. Just now I've created fraction of a second. So this Spring Boot, this will come with an embedded Tomcat server. In case of a Spring Framework, I need to do a local setup of Tomcat in my local system. But in Spring Boot, when I create a ready-made project using a Spring initializer, it will come with an embedded server, embedded Tomcat server. Okay, you don't have to do, or you don't have to do any setup for the Tomcat server. The Spring Boot project, by default come with an embedded Tomcat server. Okay, so there is some other server also is there, Jetty is there. I'll come into those things. So that is another one point. I'm talking the difference. That means Spring Boot with Spring initializer comes with an embedded Tomcat server. Okay, Spring Boot with Spring initializer comes with an embedded Tomcat server. Right? So this is another one point we got about Spring Boot. That was in case of a Spring Framework, we need a local setup, Control X. We need a local setup. But in case of Spring Boot, we don't need a local setup. because Spring Boot came with the embedded Tomcat server. That means this application just now I have downloaded, right? This is one Spring Boot application using a Spring initializer. Just now I've created it. So it will come with an embedded application server. Tomcat related jars I have to download. Correct. I want to work on Spring Web related jars I have to download. So what type of Spring Framework application I want to do, based on that the corresponding jars I have to download. But it is not like here in case of Spring Boot. In case of Spring Boot, there is a concept called starter, Spring Boot starter. In case of Spring Boot, let me tell you, in case of Spring Boot, it is not like that you have to download each and every module separately or download each and every dependency separately. Spring Boot support lots of starter project. What I'm saying here is that Spring Boot support lots of starter project. Spring Boot support lots of starter projects. Lots of starter project means let me see some of the example. Assume this concept is there in the Spring Boot. When you're talking about starter project means what? It is one type of template. When I say Spring Boot support lots of starter project means Spring Boot supports lots of template. Okay, so if you have this template to create a Spring Boot project, so automatically related dependency will be available to you. Okay, what I'm saying? Spring Boot supports lots of starter projects, or sometimes very simply layman's language, if you want to say, you can say that these are templates. These are templates. Okay. So what is the advantage of these templates? So assume I want to create an Spring Boot project using, just remember the name, starter and dependency. So I want to create a Spring Boot project. First time I am going to create a Spring Boot project. Fine. So what does it mean by starter project? Starter project means, assume I want to use Spring Boot starter. It's the name of the template. If I use this template in my project, then automatically some dependencies will be downloaded by Spring Boot project during runtime, like Spring Boot, like Spring context, like Spring Beans. So if you see, these are the dependencies automatically available in your Spring Boot project. So if I want to create a Spring Boot project that need only these dependencies, I don't have to download these dependencies separately, not required. Just create your Spring Boot project using this starter. So automatically this dependency will be available. Dependency means what? Some jar files. Marvin will download these jar files, from net automatically for your project. So in case of a Spring Boot project, there is a concept called starter projects. Starter projects are called templates. So when I'm going to create any project, I have to use any one of the template. Okay, what is the advantage? Those templates will help to download related dependencies. I cannot remember each and every dependency's name because this dependencies also gets changed based on the version of the framework. So that's why, on a Spring Boot, they came with the concept called starter, which contain list of some provided dependencies. As for example, let me say some mode starter. You have to remember these things. It will come with practice. I'm going to use another one starter that is called Spring Boot starter security, or Spring Boot starter jersey. Okay, Spring Boot starter jersey. Spring Boot starter jersey. So if I'm going to use this Spring Boot starter jersey, if I'm going to use this, starter or template, then automatically some dependencies will be available to us, like jersey container servlet core. This is one of the dependency. You can just write here Control C. Some dependencies will be automatically available to us, like jersey container servlet core, then jersey container servlet. You know already, right? Jersey is nothing but one implementation to implement REST web service, right? So using Spring Boot, if I want to implement REST using Jersey implementation, then we need this dependency. So automatically some dependencies will be available to us, like Jersey container servlet core, Jersey container servlet, container servlet, Jersey server, right? So this, we have to remember that there is lots of starter template or starter project concept is there. We have a Spring Boot starter actuator. Okay, Control C, lots of starter project concept is there. Actuator. Right, we have a Spring Boot project concept called Spring Boot starter AOP. Then we have the concept called Spring Boot starter HEDOS. Okay, then we have the concept of Spring Boot starter logging. Like this way, multiple starter concept is there. Right, those things we'll talk about step by step. That means I don't have to download all the dependencies separately. Without downloading all the dependencies separately, I'll use one starter template. So automatically the related dependency I will download. Right. So what we'll talk about here is that in our discussion, what you're talking about here is that you're just going to compare Spring and Spring Boot. And you find that in case of a Spring Boot, I can get a ready-made production grade application in a fraction of a second. It supports lots of auto configurations. Spring Boot application, by default, it will come with an embedded server. That means I don't need to create a local Tomcat container support. Not required. Though by default it supports 8080 port number. If you want, you can change that one also. And Spring Boot support lots of starter project template.